So if our first panel is ready, knowing that we're just a little bit ahead of time, if our first panel is ready, I would like to introduce you to our first set of speakers. And as mentioned, we have our first speaker on this panel is Edward Santow, who's industry professor at the University of Technology, but known to most of us as the immediate past Australian Human Rights Commissioner. Ed will give an overview of his reflections on the state of things. Then we'll have the Honourable Verity Firth, also from the University of Technology, and then Marc, and then Aengus. Then what we'll do is we'll go into a panel session, and we'll ask the panel a series of questions, in particular their response to some of the issues identified yesterday, and also some of the positions put forward around the light and shade of technology on our digital child. So without further ado, I would like to hand to Ed Santow.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Ian. It's a pleasure to join you. I'm beaming in from Warimba land in the city now known as Sydney, and I pay tribute to the elders past, present, and emerging of the land that I'm on. The rise of artificial intelligence means that we're living in a fever dream of competing visions. Some of those visions are dystopian, some are utopian. On one hand, AI is making our lives better. A smartphone, which many of us take for granted today, is literally millions of times more powerful than the computers that took Apollo 11 to the moon. That's enabling new ways for us to connect, to make smarter, data-driven decisions with boundless economic and other opportunities. On the other hand, certainly in my role as Human Rights Commissioner, my melancholy duty was to look really quite closely at the dystopian reality, because the new tools that AI makes possible can also be turned against us. We've seen repression in other countries through social credit schemes enabled by AI. Closer to home, we've seen really disastrous decisions made through what came to be known as robo-debt. And unfortunately, those examples on the other side of the ledger are piling up. So to be clear, we who are living through this new digital age are not offered a choice between these utopian and dystopian realities. We experience both realities, often at the same time. That said, for some people, the gravitational pull of utopia or dystopia will be particularly strong. If, for example, you're someone who ends up being caught up in robo-debt, then no amount of fancy gadgetry from smartphones to virtual reality headsets will make up for the trauma you've experienced. So within all of this, the Royal Society has invited us to imagine the experience of a child born into this fever dream. I've taken the liberty of tweaking this scenario slightly and have imagined not one child, but twins. They're fraternal twins, a boy called Charlie and a girl called Claire. They're raised in the same home with loving parents and the comforts of an Australian suburban middle-class upbringing. The first few years of their childhood is on the whole wonderful. At least wonderful for the twins, not always for their parents who kind of wander around like exhausted zombies for much of the first few years. But Charlie and Claire's experience of the technological revolution going on around them is almost wholly indirect. It's mediated through their parents and other adults in their lives. But that starts to change as they get older and they start to engage in immersive games and other role-playing type scenarios through school and so on. But I want to fast forward to a crucial moment in the twins' lives, and it happens when they enter their teenage years. On Halloween 2034, when Charlie and Claire have each just turned 13, they go out trick-or-treating with their friends. There are no adults present. The evening starts out well, as tends to happen with these sorts of stories, and the twins have got already quite a haul of sweets. But then tragedy strikes each of the twins. Charlie, who I want to really emphasize, is a good kid, but he's led astray by one of his friends. And he's caught by a police officer throwing eggs at the home of a well-known local social media influencer. Charlie is arrested, and his demographic details are fed into an algorithmic system that determines he is at high risk of reoffending. So for the next 5 years of his adolescence, he's subjected to regular checks by the police at his home, at his school, and at his part-time job in a local motor mechanic. He develops a deep mistrust of the police and authority generally. That sends him down a particular path that is not a happy one. Claire's life also takes a crucial turn that Halloween night in 2034. While Charlie starts to throw eggs at influencers, Claire decides very sensibly to go home. But while crossing a street, she's hit by a self-driving car. The car is confused by her Halloween ghost costume and mistakes her for a low-flying cloud. Claire is critically injured. She's taken to hospital where she receives excellent treatment for her broken limbs, but the doctors are so busy treating those obvious injuries, they don't notice that she is developing sepsis. But fortunately for Claire, she happens to be in a hospital that is trialling New South Wales Health's AI-powered sepsis diagnosis initiative, and her sepsis is identified early enough to save her life with no long-lasting negative effects. That near-death experience instills in Claire a desire to help people, and she goes on to study medicine. So Charlie and Claire, of course, are fictional, but the AI systems I'm alluding to are real. And my point, and this is the last thing I'll say, is that Charlie and Claire have each grown up in the same environment. Each experiences AI at a crucial moment. And for each of them, that experience is life-changing. Our challenge as a society is to take the practical action we need to do now to bring an end to that dystopian pathway. And that will involve significant change to our law, our policy, and our education systems. That is the action that will be necessary to address the problems associated with AI-powered systems that cause harm. And it will also allow us to lean into and build community support for the kind of AI that is of benefit. So, to paraphrase Dr. Ian Oppermann in his introduction just now, I think this is the path that will take us towards a future that Charlie and Claire want and need, not one that they rightly fear.
Thank you, Ed. And could I now pass to Verity, please?
Thank you. That was a wonderful opening, Ed. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respect to elders past and present. Every technological revolution, like the one that we're in now, brings social, political and economic upheaval. And every revolution creates either new sources of power or an intensification of existing sources of power, to which there needs to be a political, social and essentially human response. The Industrial Revolution, for example, saw the rise of the labour and trade union movement and the expansion of the electoral franchise to people who didn't own property. These were the social and political responses to a laissez-faire capitalism that, in its completely laissez-faire format, was destroying communities and treating human beings as machines in the production process. Alongside the social and political responses, or perhaps as part of these responses, each technological revolution tends to be accompanied by an education revolution, as the education system seeks to respond to the needs of the era. The 19th century saw the rise of universal education for primary years. Researchers argue that this was partly in response to the extension of the electoral franchise. The state needed to educate those who had just been granted the right to vote. The education system spawned in the 19th century spoke to the economic needs of the day. Basic literacy and numeracy skills for everyone, perfectly suited to agriculture and repetitive factory work and jobs that were mostly for life. The 20th century, responding to the economic needs of the 20th century, expanded the concept of mandatory schooling into secondary years. It increased options for technical education post-school, and in addition to this, the universities provided the education of the key professions of that era. through teaching and law degrees, then later business and engineering degrees. And now we face the fourth industrial revolution. And yet again, education needs to adapt to its historical surroundings. The big shift that we're confronting is that many of the jobs associated with the 19th and 20th century labour markets can now be automated. And these are not just blue-collar manufacturing jobs. Increasingly white-collar jobs, such as journalism, medicine and law, have large parts of their job description capable of automation. And as our 21st century child grows up, jobs like these will become increasingly low status and low paid. So Marc Tucker writes about the American economy, saying that it's splitting into two pieces. One piece, highly educated and skilled, is benefiting hugely from new technologies, and the other, undereducated and less skilled, is being put out of work by them. So what sort of education do we need to provide for our child born yesterday on 4th of November 2021? Well, firstly, in a world where knowledge is instantly available, students don't need to rote learn facts. They need to be able to critically evaluate information, understand where it comes from and whether it should be trusted, and then apply that information to problems in real time. We need an education system that pitches to our human strengths, that develops and enhances the skills and capabilities that are uniquely human. This is where our competitive edge is, after all. Creativity, imagination, and a whole range of social, emotional, and communication skills will be the necessary complements to intelligent agents. At the same time, and this is the positive that Ed was talking about, advanced technologies, including AI, have the potential to transform education. AI can give educators quicker and more precise analysis of data to understand what individual students need. They can offer greater personalised learning and support and enable engaging ways to learn. This frees teachers up to undertake the higher order Socratic work that builds creative and critical thinking. At the end of the 19th century, Horace Mann famously wrote that education was the great equaliser, and there is no doubt that for many over the next century, education was a pathway out of intergenerational poverty and disadvantage. But the transformative power of education doesn't happen by accident. As new education priorities emerge in the 21st century, we must ensure equality of both access and outcomes. We cannot sleepwalk into Marc Tucker's two-piece system. The first and most fundamental inequality to overcome is material, and it was brutally exposed during COVID and the experience of online and remote learning. In Australia, while just 3% of high-income households don't have access to the internet, that rate increases to 33% amongst the lowest income households. This is a developed nation. Until we get basic access sorted out, not much else will follow. Second, we need to look at what we are teaching in our schools and how we are assessing and therefore valuing the capabilities our students need to thrive. We need to value imagination and creativity, track and develop these skills in our young people, and reward student achievement in these fundamentally human capabilities. So why does this matter so much? How does this avoid the dystopian future to which Ed was referring? Well, first, of course, we need an education system that won't let our young people down. But more fundamentally, because we need educated citizens who are going to understand the complexities of the world they live in and have the capacity to change what is wrong and to defend what is right. At the moment, we're in the heart of a technological revolution where, as Marina Gorbis writes, technologists are no longer just developing apps, they're developing political and economic systems. Humans alone have the creativity to imagine a better world. At the heart of all the greatest social and political movements has been original human thought, groundbreaking, status quo smashing, original thought. Could AI have rejected the concept of hereditary monarchy? Of course not. Human beings in Western Europe have been ruled by unelected oligarchs for centuries. The data says so, and AI builds its machine intelligence and insight from the data. Could a bot have thought about the inequalities of bargaining power between the owners of capital and labour, and therefore deduced it would be good for labour to collectively negotiate through the formation of unions? That's pretty incisive power analysis and revolutionary in its originality. Is that something that AI is capable of? We cannot allow existing inequalities in our society to be replicated as we adopt new technologies. For public trust to be maintained, it is vital that the benefits of AI are experienced equally. This is particularly so for our education system, which partners with learners to develop human knowledge and capability, ultimately leading to increased agency and power for individuals and communities. Without this, the future of democracy is uncertain, and the likelihood of a better, more equal world is nil.
Wow. Thank you, Verity. This is building very, very well. So it's my real pleasure now to pass to Marc Fennell.
I'm going to unmute myself. Hey, there we go. The lament of 2020, 2021, I'm on mute. Hi, my name's Marc. I'm the least qualified person within a 10K radius. So I'm feeling very unqualified to be here. There's about two things I feel confident predicting for a child born today. And I'm going to start with the good news. The first thing is you probably won't ever have to sit in the front passenger seat and have a coronary while teaching them how to drive a car. I'm 99.9% confident that driverless electric cars will be the norm. So if your child is born today, good news, you'll never have to do that. The second thing I'm reasonably confident about is that a child born today will undoubtedly spend their life paying off our terrible debts. Our generation and the generations before us have spent an extraordinary amount of time extracting value from this small blue dot, and somebody's going to have to foot the bill, and that person's being born as we speak. But the thing I actually wanted to talk to you about today is that the child that's born yesterday will shortly inherit a world where attacks will be made on them. They'll be brutal, they'll be devastating, and for a time they will be invisible. So for those that don't know me, I've spent the better part of the last decade interviewing and talking to technology developers, analysts, journos, literally people smarter than me. And I'm going to parrot them for the next 4 minutes. And the one thing that I don't think that gets enough attention is how our increased reliance on technology. We talk a lot about the consumer-facing part of it, but there's a whole other part to it as well. There's a vast infrastructure that underpins our lives, both physically and online, and most of us don't pay attention to it until something goes wrong. I'm talking about the extremely sexy world of infrastructure, energy systems, food delivery, and securing that, I think, is probably our next major issue. And if we're going to secure the future for that child, that's the thing I think we need to be paying more attention to. So back in the early thousands, some people on this group might already know this, many of you will. In the early thousands, an Iranian nuclear program was brought to a halt by a targeted malware attack that eventually became commonly known as Stuxnet. Now, what we know about it is that it was a state-sponsored attack. We don't know if it was the first of its kind, but when it was publicly revealed in a major way at about 2010, it did signal that in part, the next wars, the wars of our children, the child born yesterday, they're going to be fought unseen. And it's going to feel that way, at least, until the power goes out, or the water turns off, or the heating shuts down. In 2020, there were security agencies all around the world who were issuing very stark, very upfront warnings about infrastructure attacks. And just to pick from the 50 or so that were made public, for example, earlier this year, an oil pipeline in Houston, Texas, absolutely ground to halt by a malware attack. And that is just one of countless incidences around the world. In fact, when you talk to cybersecurity figures about it, they are incredibly blunt. They're like, yeah, we expected it. People don't talk about this enough. So, and to what that looks like on the ground, a couple of years ago, I happened to be in California. I was reporting on food theft. Actually, it was investigating $10 million worth of stolen almonds. Don't ask me why, it was a weird job. But the way it was done is really interesting because it was done through organized crime using identity theft to redirect literally tons of food to different warehouses and different ports. And as I started digging into it, the really stark thing that stood out to me was that this is really a story about speed and automation. The very things that we kind of point to as like the hallmarks of what makes our life convenient in 2021. And in this instance, speed and automation were actually being weaponized. In some cases, these tons of nuts were being shipped out of the port of LA without anyone noticing, simply because it happened too fast and it was too automated that people didn't know it happened until it happened. And I think that is the phrase. It doesn't happen until we don't know it happens until it happens, that I think will define the future of that child. We're moving at such a speed now that things are going to happen and we won't know they've happened until they've happened. I think if we're going to entrust a future to that child, we need to be giving them a future where technology is not a black box. It has to have some degree of transparency to it, and we have to be aware of it. Right now, the way we live our lives and the life that we've gifted to that child is one where things just get delivered and things just happen. And I think we need to building on what Verity was saying earlier, we need to fold in a future where kids understand how technology delivers them their existence. So it cannot be something where things that happen just happen and they don't realize they've happened until they've happened.
Thank you, Marc. That was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. It's now my pleasure to introduce Aengus Tran, founder and chief executive officer of Harrison.ai. Aengus.
Hi, everybody. My name is Aengus. I'm the co-founders of Harrison. Nice to meet everybody today. And just a bit about myself. I grew up in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, and I came to Australia about 14 years ago. And I got trained as a medical doctor at the University of New South Wales. And during this time, learning to be a physician, I absolutely fall in love with the practice of medicine, and its hour to impact life. I was absolutely inspired by the good that I can do to the world and the ability to use my skill to impact life in a positive way. But at the same time, I was always constantly reminded growing up in Vietnam that of a very sobering fact that the child born today will receive very different level of healthcare throughout his or her life, depending on where it is in the world or even where it is within New South Wales and within Australia. The care delivery in the rural system is not the same as a metropolitan hospital, and certainly not the same in a remote hospital in the remote of Vietnam. So in 2019, while I was being trained as medical doctors, I got really inspired by the potential for AI to scale good medicine. I was quite frustrated on how long it took to train a skilled professional in the art of medicine to become good at what they do. And clearly, in the next 20 years, the challenge of delivering good healthcare would be mostly relating to our ability to train and upskill good people at the centers of that. So at this time in 2019, there was a lot of breakthrough in AI technology that allowed the system to do incredible things like defeating the world champion at Go or mastering the art of Jeopardy from IBM. So I got quite curious on what is the applications of this technology on healthcare, an art in which I was studying at the time. So within a couple of years and a little bit of tinkering and a couple of online courses, I managed to build an AI system that is now known as Ivy. This system is very interesting. It looks at time-lapse video, very much like the one you can take on your smartphone, of human embryo growing inside incubators, and is able to predict the chance that that embryo will result in a successful pregnancy for parents. And this technology was very game-changing at the time because it reduced the time for parents who are looking to get a child to get that pregnancy earlier, because the tool is able to select the most viable embryo and giving them that parents that chance first, rather than through trial and error. Within a year or so, the tool is used all across Australia and the world. And at the end of that year, 2,000 couples' lives has been touched, and 2,000 pregnancy was resulted from the use of that technology. This was a very critical moment for me to realize that there's a very different way of practicing medicine, leveraging AI technology and building solutions that can improve the quality of care and the practice of medicine in a very, very scalable way. If I was to start my work as a clinician entering this world in the next 20 years, I would be lucky to have touched 100 lives every single year if I was a very good clinician, and perhaps hands-on hardware really changed their life in fractions of that. But AI and technology is able to scale the knowledge and the insights that we have in our data to help delivering better healthcare. And this is why I founded Harrison. After I finished my training, I gave up my career as a physician, but I do believe I'm still practicing medicine in a completely different way. My vision is to touch 1 million lives a day through a collective reach of all the AI's medical device products that we built. And the amazing thing is this is based right here out of Australia, New South Wales. We are quite a big team now. We work through partnerships, and the next piece that we've been working through, and I'm sure a lot of people have been hearing about, is the first technology that we built in partnerships, which is the analyst chest X-ray technology. Just like the science fiction movie that you might have watched, like Elysium, or maybe if you like Jennifer Lawrence, the Passenger movie. There's always this scanner that people can walk into, and the machine came up with all the findings that the AI has detected. This is the technology that we're looking to build at Harrison, and it's now being used across 300 sites in both public and private systems. So that future is definitely here, and we definitely need to think about ways to deploy this responsibly and safely. I believe that the only way that a child born today can receive the same level of care that his or her parents receive and into the future is through innovation and technology that scale the doctors of the future to be as efficient as possible. I would like to think that perhaps Ed's hypothetical child, when they walk into the ED department of the future, the trauma on the X-ray would be diagnosed by a technology built by Harrison. Perhaps when they reach their adulthood and start smoking, the lung cancer will be picked up from a surveillance program done by CT AI system, and perhaps the treatment after that would be selected carefully, driven by data, and deliver safely with assistance from AI and collaboration with clinicians. Thank you, everybody.
Well, I have to say, I think this is the best panel I've ever sat on in my entire life. What 4 fascinating perspectives, and I tried to hold the wow in, but it got out at one point. We just remind everybody that there are questions. If you want to ask a question on our panel, please use the function in your browser. But I'm going to take the prerogative as the facilitator to ask a first question, and I'm going to ask this question to all of you, but Ed, I'd like to start with you. During the course of the session yesterday and some of what was said today, we can draw analogies between AI and use of data, and I'm going to say broadly use of data where AI is one of those uses. We can draw analogies to Industrial Revolution, we can draw analogies to previous waves of technology, and yesterday Sean even talked about ancient cities and the things that happened in ancient cities and people adapting to it. Why is AI different? Why does it make a difference? Marc and Aengus both talked about different perspectives of speed, and in one case weaponizing, in the other case using it for advantage. Let me ask you, as Dorothy Dix, why is AI different? Please, Ed.
Yeah. So up until what some of my colleagues and I are describing as first generation AI, which is really kind of came about in the first 20 years of this century, we always use data, right? But I like to imagine it as this kind of chaotic room, right? You walk into someone's office and there's just paper everywhere, right? And what we were doing was we were making decisions using some of that paper, but it was incredibly difficult to do, right? Because we didn't always know how to kind of get the right piece of paper that had the data that we were looking for. And so when we were making decisions, it was a weird mix of some data-driven decision-making, some just sort of practices that we'd always done. We make the decisions this way because this is what we've always done. There's heuristics in there, and there's also just out-and-out prejudice. And what first-generation AI has done is that it's taken all of that kind of mess of paper and put it into nice, neat piles. And so really for the first time in history, we've been able to make truly more data-driven decisions. Now, have we got it right? No, there are all kinds of problems like algorithmic bias that still creep in. So first generation AI is not going to be the end point. But what it has done, and I think this is literally true, the first time in history, is that it's allowed us to actually make some sense of that data. And the last thing I'd say about that is the combination that AI brings is techniques like machine learning and massive computational power, and that combination is the thing that's really unlocked that more kind of data-driven approach.
Thanks. Can I pose that same question to Verity? Can I ask you that same question, please?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? So I think Ed's spot on, but I think my view is probably a little bit controversial, which is human beings work themselves up into an absolute lava every time there is a big technological revolution, right? So the examples I always give is the examples in ancient Greece where they first started to write down, and there was huge, complaint that this was going to mean that all the students' memories were no longer to work properly, because the whole point of having to learn your arguments and speak them was that it helped with memory retention. And so they were against the invention of writing then, or at least writing down as part of the Socratic method. Then, in the late 17th century, when books became really available, there was a huge moral panic about the role that books were playing in terms of turning young people away from their moral instruction and their chores and the things they had to do, right? The point being, we always panic when newness comes. My point is that, like every other part of history, we don't need to panic. We just need to recognize that human beings are still in charge, right? And that we have to have a response to the social, economic, and political conditions created by the new wave of technology. And we have to be confident enough in our role as human beings to be able to navigate that and build in the safeguards that need to be built in. And in fact, the more we panic about the ubiquitousness of AI, the less we will be able to respond calmly to put in place the sorts of protections that need to be put in place to make sure that our education system adapts appropriately, to make sure that people have equal access, all of those things. So I think we need to be careful not to panic.
Thanks, Verity. Marc, I'm going to ask you the same question. I'm really struck by your prediction about not needing to teach children. It's wonderful. That's a good reason to unpanic. But why is AI different?
It's interesting the thing Verity was saying. By the way, my favourite of the moral panics about technology, some people will know that I used to be a film critic. My favourite is when they brought in sound to film. Huge uproar with a cabal of, with a group of, I think it was German film critics who were like, this is terrible. We've spent all this time building this incredibly beautiful visual art. Sound will just turn it into theatre. And they were absolutely up in arms about the introduction of sound to film. That's my favourite of the moral panics. I do think AI is different in the sense that, to Verity's point, one thing it does do, or at least has the potential to do, is actually remove humans from the driver's seat. It has the potential to do this. And I'm loath to talk about it in sort of broad brushstrokes, because actually what we're talking about here is a suite of technologies interacting at various different levels of development. So it's hard to kind of talk about it in general terms. But I think within that sort of heavy parenthesis, I think it has the potential to take human beings out of the driver's seat. And I think the thing that concerns me, I think, in that context is it's the potential for lack of control coupled with the lack of visibility. And I know this is like a very typical sort of journalist response, like transparency is the answer to everything. It's not, I know. But I do think the less people understand how the data is feeding into the black box and the decisions coming out of the black box, the less we understand about that, the more we cede power. And I think that's the part where I think we do need to kind of maintain some handle on how the suite of technologies are likely to infiltrate our lives. And I think that is a fundamental difference, right? I think that is quite different to other things we've seen in the past. And I think we can certainly take lessons from the past, but I think we do need to have, I think some of it's about education and some of it is about setting in place some kind of mutually agreed guidelines about how we're going to develop technologies that are going to be ubiquitous and invisible in our lives. I was talking to some AI developers earlier in the week, and their argument was there needs to be sort of an inbuilt code of ethics. And my attitude is, well, if you look back over history, the number of times guidelines, laws, and codes of ethics have been like broadly ignored, or they've been put in place and then a company goes off and does it, and then there's a royal commission or a massive lawsuit that happens later on where we discover all the different things that they didn't do. So I don't think there's a single smoking gun, but I do think we need to kind of be, as companies now are sort of emerging out of that first generation, I do think we need to kind of apply a degree of public pressure, and I think some of this is happening, by the way, on companies that are engaging in developing this suite of technologies, and governments and commercial organisations that are going to start kind of buying these technologies to use in law enforcement or medicine. I do think there needs to be some sort of framework built into those deals so that transparency and clarity as to what data is going in and what decisions come out, so that they can be audited by human beings. So that was very general. Forgive me, I'm trying to talk about 14 different forms of technology at once. But I think in general, maintaining some kind of human visibility and keeping humans in the driver's seat where possible is important. I should also say, I know that there are very smart people that are mindful of this, but I do think sometimes in the speed to which we move forward, some of this gets lost.
Thanks very much. Aengus, I'm going to ask you the same question, then we'll go to audience questions. I mean, you talked about the power of AI to do good things, the scalability in terms of healthcare, in particular for IVF and for reading chest x-rays. Well, what makes AI different from your perspective?
I think one of the key areas that make AI really different to all of the transformative technology that has came to human civilization before is that so far, at least, so far in the last 5 to 10 years, as AI has become more ubiquitous, we have not seen the progress plateau quite yet. And I think that is the real difference, unlike other technology where, there's very clearly a ceiling where you can achieve certain achievement with those technology. So far, we've seen a linear increase in performance and capabilities of this system as you scale computation power and data. And I think that is really something that, and it often happens at the exponential rate. And we know that as human, we typically don't perceive exponential scale very well. So even us, practicing this art of AI and building this model on our daily work, I still amazed every other month or so on the pace of progress, and I still fail to predict where we'll end up in these capabilities. I guess the second part that make AI different, which has been highlighted, is this nature of learning from data. And what that means is there's often not clear rationale on why certain system behave the way that it does. Because it's learning from data, it can explore novel features and novel rationale to come up with the same conclusion, which sometimes is beneficial. So in the case of IVF, the technology that we built may have used features in these time-lapse videos that embryologists who spend a lot of time studying this embryo has never considered to be predictive for pregnancy, and that was a good thing. But at the same time, there's the downside to that. So one of the example in chest X-ray is one of the very critical findings called pneumothorax, which is gas leaking around the lung. An AI system trained naively on pneumothorax may detect the presence of what we call a chest tube, which is the tube that you put into the chest to drain the air from the pneumothorax, and mistaken the pneumothorax for the chest tube because those two things often happen together. So for example, at Analyse, one of the things that we do is we always put the clinician at the center of the development of this AI system. So using them to annotate this data set and embedding the clinical knowledge and human understanding into this data is quite critical, rather than blindly replicating the the biases or the practice of medicine that has came before it. We need to have a conversation about what do we want this AI system to do and what is the good reflections of our moral value and the outcome for the patient that we want, and then encoding that into the data that we collect and therefore into the AI system of the future. So I think those are some of the fundamental difference between, technology that came before AI and what it is doing now.
Thanks, Aengus. That's really, really good. That actually leads very nicely into the first audience question, which I will now a little less selfishly hand over to. So the question is, do you think there needs to be a digital/AI think tank support group? I can see the awareness of the opportunity is there, but how do we translate this into our hierarchy? Do we need some sort of group who are thinking this through for us, trying to tackle these wicked challenges on our behalf in some way, shape, or form? And Ed, you look most enthusiastic to respond.
I'm intrigued by the idea, and I'm not sure, I'm not sure I fully understand it. I mean, I think
these are subtle and complex issues. Is there a group that we should turn to who should be doing some of the heavy lifting, thinking about the structures for us?
There are already like 14 of these.
Well, there certainly are the academies.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like there are these big decisions that companies and government agencies make about how they're going to use AI. And often the problem that they have is that they don't have really any training in how to make a good decision there. So typically, the training that they get to make a good strategic decision about how to use AI, they get almost wholly from the vendor, whoever is the tech company who's actually selling them the tool. Now, I don't want to suggest that vendors are doing the wrong thing, but there's not a perfect alignment of interest there, or maybe there's a too perfect alignment of interest there between the vendor saying, learn in this particular way so that you can buy my product. It would be much better if companies and government agencies could have kind of a source of independent, impartial advice, where when they're coming to kind of really consider these issues, they could lean into that. And so that's a big part of what we're doing at UTS, Verity and myself, kind of increasing training for people, so not to turn everyone into PhD level data scientists, but rather to give people the basic kind of information that they need. And then when I was at the Human Rights Commission, we recommended the establishment of what we were calling an AI Safety Commissioner. And the idea there would be, it would be a source of independent, impartial advice, particularly for government, in how they should consider how to safely use and effectively use AI. So I'm not sure if that quite answers the question, but one of the lessons I learned from 5 years of Senate estimates is sometimes it's better to answer the question you wish you were asked than the question you actually posed.
I'm sure the person who posted the question wished I'd asked it in a different way. I may have mangled it ever so slightly, so my apologies. Verity, I want to throw a second question to you, and it goes very much along with the theme that you were talking about. So the question, the setup is, this isn't the first technological and disruptive change to society. The benefits of the Industrial Revolution were only shared in part because of the collective actions of people who came together, formed unions, and stood up for change. It wasn't without pain or strife, the Great Depression, general strike. Will we navigate this, the fourth Industrial Revolution, without such pain and collective action?
That's a really good question, because my gut reaction is probably no, there will be pain and strife and the need for collective action, because there always is, right? When there is actually a fundamental shift in who controls power in society, we're shifting from a new set of oligarchs when you think about it. And whenever there's a shift like that, there is going to be pain and the need for collective action. I suppose I think what Marc was saying is relevant here too, right? Like, really one of the challenges we have with AI is for these new sources of power and these new places where power is collected to be transparent enough that people actually know where to aim their political action. And I think that has been a bit of a problem in the past. everyone was sort of, we're looking at Facebook, right? Everyone's so keen to adopt Facebook that it's only now that everyone's really beginning to realise the impact of that Facebook has had on our democracy, and how is collective action going to really bring Facebook down, So my thesis, as I suppose it espoused in my opening, is really the only thing you could do in these situations is education, right? Is actually making sure that we have a citizenry that understands the power dynamics of our age. And again, when you look at history, that is basically what happened in previous industrial revolutions, right? When franchise was extended in the 19th century and suddenly all these people had a vote and suddenly they were given access to literacy skills en masse for the first time, those people became more educated about the power dynamics of their society. And even when you look at the growth of the early labour movement, a lot of that was about educating people. They used to have workers' collectives where they would all sit around and read and learn about the power dynamics, right? So my optimistic take on this is that we need an education system that equips citizens en masse with the skills to be able to recognise the power dynamics of our age, and it is from that will rise the collective action. But it's been difficult up until now because A, we haven't really known what's been going on in any mass sense. B, as Marc says, there isn't that transparency or even understanding. And C, it all just seems so otherworldly to the vast majority of people. It just seems so complex and so ubiquitous that people would prefer to turn on the smart TV or log on to Facebook.
I mean, just to Ed's point earlier, though, I do think there is value in empowering, this is going to sound terrible, but empowering the state or giving some sort of, like, I think it's one thing to kind of entrust the public to kind of hold technology companies and to account, but I do think there is value in actually having state power in managing some of this. And, I know that's an idea that can be debated as to how much power, but something like a human rights commissioner, I think there is value in that, in having an authority that can say, open up your damn black box, show me how this thing works, right? And I think part of the issue is it's all of this stuff, a lot of it's commercial in confidence, right? You're not going to be able to share it. And I think that's actually part of the problem. It becomes a direct relationship between, to the point earlier, vendor and, if we want to take the scariest examples, right? So let's say, law enforcement, if that's a commercial relationship with law enforcement and civil rights activists, potential victims of police brutality are having to deal with the results of what goes in and out of that box and have no visibility into how that box is working, that is a absolute recipe for disaster. And so I think there is value. Yes, obviously, I think we do need to have a public who are much, much, much more informed. But I think there's a component of that dynamic where there does need to be some authority that can step in and go, open it up, show me how it works. And so we can see exactly, what the likely issues are going to flow from there are going to be. Now, there's a range of ways in which that can go wrong, by the way. So, it's very much a how.
And to be honest, and just quickly, I totally agree with Marc too. Like, I think you can have both. And I think the more educated your citizenry are and the more likely you are to have a better state response as well.
Yeah, you can buy that license with the public, can't you, if they know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Great, absolutely fantastic. I'm going to jump to a question which somewhat builds on that. And Aengus, I'll throw it to you just because you haven't had much of a chance to jump into the conversation, but I'd certainly be willing to hear from anyone on the panel. Let's imagine that critical thinking and inquiry skills were the basis of education from tomorrow, let's say from Monday. What would our technology and civilization look like for this child in 20 years' time, so the 2040 sort of time frame, if we had more people interacting through the Socratic method? So the important parts of that question really are, if critical thinking and inquiry were the basis of education, given that we can have access to any fact through the internet or any bit of information through the internet, the importance is in that critical thinking and inquiry.
Yeah, I think, as we continue to use this form of technology where, perhaps the logic behind some of the decisions that these systems are making is not as obvious as previous system used to be, like what we like to call if-then statement in programming, where you can use logic and deduce an outcome from a given set of circumstances. I think critical thinking and inquiring skill of the child in 20 years' time, especially when AI is becoming more predominant, would need to be specifically relating to how these systems are being built and how those parameters around building this system will impact how the system behaves. So, for example, if we're taking the examples of an AI system that predicting the outcomes of an embryos for IVF, we wouldn't be able to inquire specifically which features that the AI is using to select that particular embryos. Perhaps it's the size of the cells or the timing that it takes to do the divisions. Those wouldn't be as logically available. However, what is something that needs to be critical consider is the data set that was used to train this system. Which population was that data created from, and what diversities of population was included in that data set, and is there any bias in the outcome of those factors that is subsequently being encoded into the system. So I think that is the kind of knowledge that people will start getting over time, through the education, and I really do believe that this is starting to trickle through into the way that people are being educated.
Thank you.
Can I jump in on this one, Anne? I think it's such a good question, this one about critical thinking and inquiry skills. And I think what we need to do, if I may, is just pause a bit to consider how AI is changing the way we think. And I would put to you that it is changing the way we think in the most profound, revolutionary way humanity has ever experienced. So at the heart of AI is machine learning. And what machine learning really is, it's a fancy way of describing pattern recognition. In other words, it automates our ability to see correlations between two things, right? And that relies on labeling. So to give an example, if we all experience email, right? So any kind of major email service provider will try to differentiate between emails that you want to receive, or at least emails that you should receive, and spam, right? And that works because over time, it correlates certain features of emails that are spam, non-genuine emails, and certain features of emails that are genuine emails. Now, that's inductive reasoning, right? And we've always engaged in some inductive reasoning, but we've always prized deductive reasoning because it allows us to actually understand, why X causes Y. This is just correlations that this thing seems to be associated with this other thing. Now, as we become so reliant on correlations, I think one of the lessons that we are sort of forgetting as humanity is that most correlations are completely and utterly meaningless. They can send us down a terrible, terrible path of ignorance and kind of mistruth. And so, going back to the question, the critical thinking and inquiry skills are so important. If we see these correlations through, machine learning tools, our next step should not be to say, oh, okay, then these two things must be, truly connected. Our next step should be to go on a path of inquiry to find out whether those two things really are connected. And when you see, AI has a failure rate of up to 85% in the real world, not in the lab, in the real world. In fact, there is nothing that we do now that is more prone to failure than artificial intelligence. And part of the reason is that we engage in this magical thinking that it always works, and most of the time it doesn't. So what we really need to do is be able to differentiate between when it's throwing up really useful information that we can rely on and when it doesn't. And that can, I think, allow us to sort of supercharge AI to give us, as I said, the future that we want and need.
Thanks, Ed. This is really, really great stuff. Let me Verity, throw a question to you around the meaningful work. So the question is, what will purposeful and meaningful work look like for this child when they reach later adolescence? The question then goes on to ask, what would apprenticeships look like? How might we emphasise non-institutionalised learning? But really, just want to ask you about meaningful work for this child.
Yes, that's right. And one of the pieces I was reading as I was preparing my remarks for this session talked directly about what meaningful work would look like in the 21st century. And the big argument of that essay was you've got to make sure that meaningful work is not only available for just a small group of elite, highly educated professionals and everyone else does utterly meaningless work, or even worse, what actually happens is there's such surplus labour as all of the sort of rote things get done that you just sort of have a big surplus labour pool that you either fund through universal basic income but essentially have nothing to do. Now, that's real dystopian future stuff, but still the idea of what is meaningful work if a whole lot of the more traditional rote things are now to be done by machines. And the answer in my head would be it's the human work, right? It's what Ed just talked about. It's the capacity to analyze the data or the machine learning that's appearing in front of you and apply an extra dimension to that, an extra dimension of human reasoning and critical thought and capacity to actually see where does that data source come from. Okay, no, I don't quite trust that, and these are the reasons why, and I understand why that happens. But also the stuff that machines can never do, the genuinely original thought, the creative process. And I know that there's been debates now about machines even writing, beautiful, symphonies, and everyone going, oh my gosh, machines can even do the creative process. But really, can they? So I don't I don't really believe that. So I think meaningful work for humans in a more and more automated environment will be those human elements. Now, you asked specifically, what does an apprenticeship look like? Well, I think already we're seeing this. I know that things like apprenticeships for mechanics nowadays, there is so much nowadays that a mechanic no longer has to do, especially when you have computerized engines. But what do you teach the mechanic to do? You teach the mechanic to actually be able to properly interpret the computerized information that's coming from the engine. You can see how much I know about mechanics, but you know what I mean? Like it's much more automated nowadays, but that's what you teach. You teach them the interpretation skills, the analytic skills, the capacity to deal with customers, the social interaction skills, the capacity to deal with difficult customers who don't like your price point. There are all sorts of other skills that we need to embed more into our education system for the different types of jobs that will be meaningful going forward.
Thanks. But Marc, could I get you to weigh in on that question about purposeful and meaningful work?
Very hard to predict. I vividly remember talking to a futurist about 20 years ago, and it's burnt in my mind that he said that the number one job in 2021 will be aerospace engineering. And in a year where none of us have been able to fly, I remember that's always stuck with me. I think, for the longest time, we've predicted that increased education would mean fewer service jobs, fewer manufacturing jobs. And some of that has proven true. Some of it hasn't. I mean, particularly in light of last year, we realized actually how vital things like service jobs actually are. So I think you're in dangerous territory when you're trying to predict the future of jobs, because 5 years ago, you couldn't have predicted that a TikToker would be an actual career. So I'm always very careful to kind of predict what that is actually going to be, because those things change not in 20-year cycles, but in like 3-year cycles. But I think if we're talking about meaningful jobs, I think that actually sidesteps technology entirely, and that's a psychological question. It's about working out what are the things we still need as human beings, and we've always needed as human beings, and the tools will change likely. But I actually don't think those psychological needs are going to shift. People are still going to want to feel fulfilled. They're still going to want to feel like they contribute something. They're still going to need security. Economic security has a huge impact on mental health well-being. Those things don't change. Like, those things haven't changed for 20 years. The tools around them, however, change so fast that I'm very hesitant to predict what that's going to be in 2 years' time. So I would just say that any conversation we have about future jobs, The tools will change, the technological environment, the economic environment will shift, but if we focus in on what we know people have always needed and will always need, fulfillment, economic security, they're likely to still care about their families, and so they'll be thinking about long-term financial choices. People will still want to feel safe in terms of having homes, so they'll be thinking about savings, and they'll be thinking about debt in terms of mortgages. That sort of territory hasn't shifted for thousands of years, and I think if we focus in on those core needs and then ascertain as the technology and economic shifts around them what the impacts are going to be, I think that's the only prism through which I can think about this. So, which is absolutely not the answer you needed, but it's kind of the only way I know how to navigate it.
Thanks very much, Mark. Interesting, I had a conversation some time ago trying to identify jobs that would still exist in 100 years' time. We came up with three. One of them was politician, one of them was barrister, and the other one was something else altogether. But there are some jobs that seem to have longevity. I've got one last audience question to ask before I throw the unfair question to you. And if you watched yesterday, you'll know what the unfair question is. But Aengus, I'm going to ask you about explainability. The question it covers many different areas about the difficulty of explaining to someone if they didn't get a mortgage or the result of a surgical operation because of the complexity of the underlying algorithm. In the world that you operate in, how important is explainability, and when do we reach a point where we need to do something else because of the complexity of the algorithm other than explain how the algorithm's actually working? So really questions about explainability.
I think it's entirely depending on what you mean by explainability. So for example, when we build an AI system, explainability, at least to us, meaning being able to convince the clinicians on the findings that we predicted that is sensible. So if we flag that the patients have a lung nodule on a chest x-ray, explainability meaning pointing out where that lung nodule is and how confident the model thinks that that nodule is there. But I think in certain systems, sufficiently complex system may not be able to be explained in a way that we think of currently as explainability. So there's been work being done where, very complex systems that make very complex decisions about surgical operation, where the explanation is not intuitive and is not interpretable. So in fact, there's AI system that's been built to predict what would be a reasonable explanation that the human would accept. So I think that's something that we need to kind of ask ourselves that, what do we need the AI system to explain to us, and what would need to be there for us to feel that they are safe? Because really the interrogations on the explainability really come from the other end, which is the data, because the explanation is actually in the data that the AI system is trained on, and the way that it's using that to make prediction is even now, I would say, too complex and non-intuitive to our mind. But certainly I think this is a very important factor, because for us to trust this system to make big decisions for us and support us in navigating some of these choices, we need to at least understand the very basics of how the system are built, and then in which basis that these insight that is extracted through machine learning came about in the first place.
Thanks, Aengus. We have 4 minutes left for the session before we go to our 10-minute break. So from each of you, a 1-minute response, please. What must we start doing Monday in order to ensure that we have the utopian version of the future as opposed to the dystopian version of the future? And Ed, I'm going to start with you.
Can I come at this from an oblique angle? I was trying to explain to my 4-year-old earlier this week about the Melbourne Cup, about horse racing. And he was really confused by my explanation, because I didn't start with explaining that it's the humans that ride the horses, not the horses that ride the humans. And I actually think that that's step one. We've got to be really clear that we are the ones who are in control of the machines, and we've got to be really clear about our respective roles. Too often, I think we're ceding to the machines things that we shouldn't. And probably too often we're doing things that machines can do better. So getting that really clear.
Great, fantastic. Thank you very much. Verity?
I loved Ed's response. It's fantastic. If I was doing something first thing Monday, it would be about directly addressing the digital divide. Like, all of this is a moot point when we still have 33% of people on low incomes who don't even have connectivity in their house. If we're saying the whole world is going to be more dependent on digital systems and AI, and there's a huge track of low socioeconomic families who don't even have access in the first place, that's a big problem. A really good example of that is the communities that we work with in southwestern Sydney for university access programs through the centre that I run. We have 300 students in a particular program. During COVID, the university bought 100 laptops. 1 in 3 students did not even have a device to work from home when we were in remote learning. So that, if we're talking about first steps, that's a pretty fundamental first step. Actually make sure in an advanced developed economy like ours that the actual material to be able to engage with this new digital world is available for all.
Thanks, Verity. Marc?
Ask more questions and make sure that you are empowered to get answers. Is the short version of it. I think this stuff is coming at us really fast, and it's coming at us with not a lot of consent. What will happen is that the ATO or police organisations or your insurance companies, they will start acquiring access to this technology, and you will not get a say in it. They will get access, and it'll become part of your life before you've even noticed. And my point is, we need to be applying pressure now to make sure that we have the answers as to how that technology is impacting our life, and we need to be making sure that government or public institution, maybe we're looking at like the equivalent of Choice magazine but for technology. We need to make sure that when we ask questions of our technology, and these institutions are doing deals that impact our life, that we are empowered to get answers. And that needs to be in place from Monday, if not 5 or 6 years ago, because I don't think it's okay that this technology is impacting our life without our consent, and that has already started.
Thanks very much, Marc. Aengus, we've got 30 seconds left.
I think we need to increase the number of people from different background and expertise and perspective who are aware and in fact expert of this technology, because AI, like anything else, is a tool, and we need people who use that tool to do things that are not exclusively dystopian. So I think this is a very great start. So I think we're already doing that, getting that knowledge out that this technology exists and what it can do and where can it go wrong. And we can use that in many other different areas, but we need that perspective and that diversity of thoughts around the tables and people thinking about this.
Great, fantastic. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Verity. Thank you, Marc. Thank you, Aengus. This has been one of the most enjoyable panels I've ever been on in my entire life. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, folks, we will now take a 10-minute break. We're back at 10:30 Eastern Daylight Savings Time, and I hope you enjoy a short break for a cup of tea. See you in 10 minutes. Thank you very much.